So our topic today is the second in the series called Ingredients of Nationhood. I felt that at the time that we were learning Shmois Va'era Bai Bashalach, let's learn about what makes us a nation in order to understand what we are here today, what we are today, or what we're supposed to be today, and what we're missing. Before we start, I want to say take a special moment to thank Elliot Horowitz, Elliot and Shanti, who are sponsoring for the yard site of Elliot's father, Alav Shalom, Mr. Harry Horowitz, whose yard site is Daled Shvast, which is the 30th yard site for Elliot's father, Yosef Tzvi ben Arav Pesach Halevi. Elliot, I'd like to know more, and I didn't have a chance to ask before share about him, but all I can say is that he must be one very proud father and grandfather and great grandfather of the family, and Metz Hashem, continued intellectual pursuit and integrity and honesty in intellectual and Torah pursuits should continue for many, many generations to come. Thank you for your always your specific and precise ha'aras on anything we learn together. I look forward to learning more, Metz Hashem. So let's start talking about the story. Let's start talking and appreciating the story that we're learning. So in 1936 there was something called the Peel Commission. The Peel Commission was set up by England concerning the mandate of Palestine at the time, and it was set up in reaction to what? Peel Commission was in response to Arab riots, nothing new. The Arabs were upset. Why were they upset? Because there were too many Jews coming into the British mandate of Palestine. After all, it's one Jewish homeland is one too many for the folks nearby. Yeah. And although they were creating many job opportunities, there also was a sense of that were called our ancestral homeland, according to the Palestinians, or they weren't called Palestinians at the time. That was a name that came up a little bit later. Was being taken. The local Arabs. Some of them were Egyptian Arabs, some of them were Syrian Arabs, and some of them were Arabs who'd been there for many generations, depending on. But they felt that the Jews were encroaching. So the English, in order to pander towards the Arab world, set up a commission to understand the background of this whole phenomenon. You have two different groups of people living on this land with very different claims and narratives. So David ben Gurion was summoned to the commission, and he presented the following evidence. And he said a very, very powerful observation. He says, 300 years ago, a ship called the Mayflower set sail to the New World. In it were Englishmen unhappy with English rule and government who sought an uninhabited coast to settle and establish a new world. They landed in America and were among the first pioneers and builders of that land. This was a major event in the history of England and America. But I'd like to know, is there a single Englishman who knows the exact date and hour of the Mayflower's launch? How much do American children or grown-ups know about the historic trip? Do they know how many people were in that boat, their names, what they wore, what they ate, their path of travel, what happened to them on their way, where they landed? Now, folks, I became naturalized in this country. So when you study these things, actually it's fascinating, although I doubt most Americans know any of the basics about American government. It's a really very fascinating subject to study. And he goes on, says David ben Gurion, more than 3,300 years ago, before the Mayflower set sail, the Jews left Egypt. Any Jewish child, whether in America or Russia, Yemen or Germany, knows that his forefathers left Egypt at the dawn of the 15th of Nisan. What did they wear? The belts their belts were tied and their staffs were in their hands. They ate matzos and they arrived at the Red Sea after 7 days. And he goes on to describe what they ate in the desert and their sojourns and the place they stopped and all the names of their ancestors. And then he goes on to say, and every year that we commemorate this event, those children carry on telling that story and they say, in the next year we will be in Jerusalem. And part of the story is where we're going to. That's what David ben Gurion said to the commission, which is essentially a very important idea to remember in the politics of today. Those who support what's called the Palestinian right for self-determination talks about the narrative of being dispossessed from their land. So sometimes what we do is we try to explain why we didn't really dispossess and how we're trying to do it in a very humane way and all these things. But we forget the narrative. What David ben Gurion said is, let's talk about the narrative. We were also dispossessed many years before that. And we're coming back to what we were dispossessed from. And yes, we may speak Romanian at the beginning when we come, but our ancestors, fathers, came to this land long before. anybody else was here of this nature or this ilk. This is what the story is, and this investigation of our time together today is to understand the importance of stories or shared story as part of nationhood. Why this is a necessary component of our nation. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov is quoted saying in Chayei Moharan, he says the following: Ha'olam omrim shesipurei ma'asiyos mesugal sheina. The world says that those who tell stories, and the stories bring us to sleep. But I say, that really, truly telling stories wakes people up from their sleep. Wakes us from our slumber of the generations. It's to appreciate who we are, where we are, where we're coming from. Now, he's referring to more particularly Hasidic stories. And he was very famous at telling very enigmatic stories. But I think let's stretch it a little further and think about the stories of ourselves, who we are. Why is this so important? So it's interesting. There's a very, very powerful book called the Kuzari, written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, written based on a legend of old that there was a king in the Far East who's of a particular province called the Khazars, who apparently did an intellectual investigation and became Jewish. So he wrote a theoretical, we'll call it dialogue, between the Melech Khuzar and various religions, ending with the Jews, and his investigation of it through the Socratic method of conversation and dialogue, question after question after question. And so what is interesting is the first set of paragraphs are very intense between the conversation between the king of the Khuzars, who wakes up, he has this dream, he knows that he's supposed to be doing something right, he has the right intentions, incorrect actions, he's trying to find his way, he speaks to a Christian, a Muslim, a philosopher, doesn't find that he's satiated in their conversation, so he turns to the Jews. And here's what he says to himself. Amar Kuzari in source 2, Ani ro'eh shetzarich ani lishol al Yehudim. Perhaps, you know what, it can't hurt after all this to speak to them Jews. After all, they are the remnant of the nation of Israel. They claim that there is this teaching in the land. So he goes and he calls the Jew. Enter Jew, right? So now we have Jew, and the Jews called Chaver. There's a wise sage as opposed to Chacham, which was the name of the philosopher, but he's called Chaver. So what's the first opening volley given by this Chaver? So the Chaver says to him, Anachnu ma'aminim be'elokei Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov hamotzias b'nei Yisrael miMitzrayim ba'asos u'mavsim v'masos. We believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who took us out of Egypt and fed us in the Hamechal Kalam Bamidbar, sustained us in the desert, and brought us to the land of Canaan, who brought us across the sea, across the Jordan, with great wonders. And we got the book of Moses, we got the book of the prophets afterwards, that tell us about the good reward for keeping this book, and the punishment for forfeiting it. And there's much mentioned in the Torah, and it's much too long for 1 foot. So we need to study more. That's what the Jew says, right? So it sounds pretty, as a pretty reasonable, summary. If you were to give a summary of Judaism, it's a pretty reasonable summary of Judaism. But the Melech Khuzar does not like this approach. He says this is inappropriate. In fact, he actually denigrates the Jew for this opening. And he says, and the Kuzari says, Amar Kuzari, Maskima Yisishal Yeshal Yehudi. I knew I shouldn't have asked Jews, right? Jews are always sidetracked, detours, getting involved in other conversations. They spent too long as a persecuted minority in the diaspora, and that stopped their thinking well, right? They're not able to conceive of logical ideas. So Jew, this is what you should have said. Let me try to help you rephrase your argument. He says, you believe in the creator of the world. Why? The reason you believe in God, Jew, is because God created the world and you. Right? Let's scope it back to when it really started. The reason why you should believe in God is because He created us. That's more universal. That's we'll call it a grander scale. You're telling me these little, anecdotes, here and there, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, these individuals, and this Egypt business. Like, it's so small. It's so small, this scale of things. Start reading Near Eastern archaeology. Start reading the stories that there's a much larger game afoot than what you're telling me. So it sounds like, it's like you're missing the point. Right, that's the Melech Kuzari says. So a number of different dialogues ensue, and at the end of this whole dialogue, a number of paragraphs later, what the Melech Kuzari says is the following, and this is the Chaver response, and he says the following in the over the page. He says, Amara Chaver. At the end, he says the following. I'm going to explain to you why I answer this way. When Moses presented himself in front of Pharaoh, the parashiyos we're learning now, what was the claim that Moshe Rabbeinu says to Pharaoh? The God of the Hebrews sent me. What does that mean? Why did Moses choose to talk about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Why didn't he talk about the creator of the world? It's because people knew about Abraham. Because that was what people related to. He didn't say the God of creation. He didn't say my creator, your creator. Then similarly, God said the same thing. Where's that statement? That's Aseret Dibros. I mean, the first of the commandments in the Aseret Dibros is about Yetzias Mitzrayim, not about Brias Shamayim V'Aretz. Isn't that a more impressive resume? Isn't that more universalistic? Isn't that the context of all reality? I mean, Egypt happened to be a dot on we will call it on the graph, but what about the graph? I'm saying, like, why doesn't God tell us the whole context? So he says, why? Because and that's why I started this way, Melech HaKuzar, O King of the Khazars, Kasher She'il Tiu Al Ma'al Emonasi, Heshivosicha Ma'ashani, Chayav Boy V'Chayavim Boy Kol Klal Yisrael. I'm telling you what I am obligated to, and what all of Israel is obligated to. Why Asher Yisbarer Etzlam B'Ma'amad HaHu B'Ro'os Einayim. I'm telling you what we experienced. Meaning, at creation, there was no one to experience that. In order for us to be who we are, we needed to have experienced and see God. God relates to us through the events that formed who we are. Which means that if we think about this clearly, that it's not about necessarily the physics, but the history. That's what essentially the Melech Kuzar is saying. In order to know who your identity is, yes, it's possible, as Avraham Avinu himself did. He looked at creation, he said, this is remarkable, there's all these different pieces, and they seem to be this power, this entity, and he tried to work out who's at the top of this pyramid. Right? So it is possible to find God that way. He says, but that's not necessarily empirical. What is empirical to us is our experience. So God reached out through history to us. There are lots of different ways to ask how to prove God. And one of them is through physics. But there's another one that Melech Kuzar says it's through history. And it's not just his story, it's actually my story. In order for me to understand and know that God has a relationship with me, I need to be the one who's connected to this. So it's coming back to that notion of the story starts with us. The story starts with us, with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and then finally Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is why it's such a central tenet in our faith. But let's go further. So let's reverse those 3,300 years. Let's go back into the world of Egypt. And today we have a little bit of a problem because we think of Egypt as this third world country in the northmost northeast corner of Africa, which is essentially just tapering on bankruptcy, with an economy on the brink, sustained by, at this point in time, American foreign aid, and then before the 60s on Russian, Soviet foreign aid. At that point in time, had a few exciting firework bangs, but really an economy on the brink of collapse, with an unstable military government essentially at this point in time. And we look at that and we say, Egypt, that's not what it meant when we reversed 3,300 years ago. Egypt was essentially the entire North Africa and spilling over into the Middle East. It was the greatest commercial and military empire the world had ever known at that point in time. And yes, it waned later on, but it was a very significant powerhouse in the civilized world. And the leader of that world was a man by the name of, at this point in time, Ramses. Ramses was a very powerful individual. In fact, just to understand how powerful he viewed himself, Ramesses means Ra is the god, is the god of the sun, and Mesis means child. So his name was Rameses. I am the child of the sun god, right? That's how he operated, which is why you can appreciate the penultimate Makkah was, of course, Choshech, right, when the sun stops, right? So you have to understand why the severity, the climactic reach of the 11th plague was so significant. So you have Rameses. By the way, that's why Moshe Rabbeinu, why was he called Mesis or Moses? Because one of the reasons could be is he was a child. Mesis means child, right? Rameses, right? So he was called child. He was pulled out of the Nile. So you have Rameses. He makes these incredible edifices. One of the most powerful nations of the time. So Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has this beautiful, beautiful observation. And he says, if you were to have had an interview with Rameses at this point in time and had a conversation and said, out of all the people around you, who's going to be the one who lasts the longest? He would never in his wildest imaginations have thought that nothing, nameless Hebrew who's making bricks as a substrata of society, not even worthy of identity or naturalization or even foreign citizenship, would have any future at all. And yet, ironically, the Egyptians of the old are gone, and the Jews remain. But where did it start? So Rav Sachs has a very beautiful observation, which is to be found in his book called Radical Then, Radical Now, or A Letter in the Scroll, and he says the following. This is such a powerful, we take it for granted, but it's such a powerful observation in Source 3. Egypt and Israel 3 millennia ago were nations that asked themselves the most fundamental human question of all. How do we defeat death and conquer mortality? How, in the brief span of human life, do we participate in something that will endure long after we are no longer here? The Egyptians gave one answer, an answer through the ages that has tempted our emperors and tyrants, rulers and kings. We defeat mortality by building monuments that will stand for thousands of years. Their stones will outlive the winds and sands of time. And that's true. If you go to Egypt, one of the only things that supports the Egyptian economy is tourism, right? So go and see their stones, right, as they stand there thousands of years ago. And in a certain sense, yes, but that's all that's left of them. The Jews gave an entirely different answer. The Israelites, slaves in Egypt for more than 200 years, were about to go free. 10 plagues had struck the country. Whatever the cause, they seemed to convey a message. The God of Israel is on the side of freedom and human dignity. On the brink of their release, Moses, the leader of the Jews, gathered them together and prepared to address them. He might have spoken about freedom. He could have given them a stirring address about the promised land to which they were traveling, the land flowing with milk and honey. Or he might have prepared them for the journey that lay ahead, a long march across the wilderness. Instead, Moses delivered a series of addresses that seemed to have makes no sense in the context of that particular moment. He presented a new idea, revolutionary in the character whose implications remain challenging even now. He spoke about children and the distant future, and the duty to pass on the memory to the generations yet unborn. 3 times he turned to them, and here we have, 3 times in Parshas Bo, when Moshe is on the brink of releasing the nation of Israel, he talks about education. Next paragraph, he says at the end, freedom, Moses suggested, is won not on the battlefield, not in the political arena, but in the human imagination and will. To defend a land, you need an army. To defend freedom, you need education. You need families and schools to ensure that your ideals are passed on to the next generation and never lost, or despaired of or obscured. The citadels of liberty are houses of study. Its heroes are teachers, its passion is education, and the life of the mind. Moses realized that a people achieves immortality not by building temples or mausoleums, by engraving their values on the hearts of their children, and they on theirs, and so on until the end of time. The Israelites built living monuments to life, and became people dedicated to bringing new generations into being and handing on to them the heritage of the past. Such a brilliant observation. So we take it for granted, of course, education. That's not an of course. And by the way, it's happening right here in America. Right now is when you start redefining what the history is. When you start saying that perhaps 1619 is the year, not 1776. When you start trying to understand what is our history, or when people no longer are interested in talking about the history of the shared story of a nation, then there are other people who are going to come in and tell different stories. You're going to have Somalian refugees who come to this country and benefit from the incredible country and liberty of this country and move their way to Congress and bite the hand that fed it. That's what's going to happen in a country that doesn't remember its own story. Because yes, this is an oppressive, persecuting, slave-touting nation. That's not the narrative of America. There are many blemishes in the past of America that need to be corrected. There are. But the story of America needs to be remembered by its citizens. In a time when Memorial Day and Independence Day are simply consumer happiness days, and the idea of what it means to have fought for freedom, that freedom is not free, is something clearly being forgotten by the fringes of the cities, not in the heartland of the country. This is something which requires a little bit of observation for the present as well. We need to be cognizant of this. It doesn't take too long. This is only 250 years for this very young country, and Judaism somehow is still telling the story. And somehow we're still here. That was what Moshe Rabbeinu was able to make the observation. And by the way, to dig it a little deeper, this is an article. It's such a powerful article that I came across in 2013. It's a story. It's an article in the New York Times called "The Stories That Bind Us." By Bruce Feller. Very, very fascinating article. He talks about an Emory professor. His name was Dr. Marshall Duke, a psychologist, who had this theory. His theory is that he was talking about the articles about the dissipation of family values. Especially in the 90s, this was a big thing. A lot of the movies reflect that, of that era, of that milieu, of the sort of the family unit breaking apart. It's interesting to see how you will call it. So the pop culture reflects what's happening in society. And he says the following: there was a lot of research at the time into the dissipation of the family, he told me, at his home in the suburban Atlanta. But we are most interested in what families could do to counteract these forces. Second paragraph in source 4. Around that time, Dr. Duke's wife, Sarah, a psychologist who works with children and learning disabilities, noticed something about her students. The ones who know a lot about their families tend to do better when they face challenges, she said. Now, that's, by the way, anecdotal. Right? So that's not research-based. So she's just saying, I've not spoken a lot of kids, and a lot of kids who seem to, I know where they come from, do better. Right? That's her observation as a clinician. So now he was intrigued. Her husband was intrigued, and along with a colleague, Robin Fivish, set out to test her hypothesis. They developed a measure called the Do You Know scale and asked children the answer to answer 20 questions. Examples included: do you know where your grandparents grew up? Do you know where your mom and dad went to high school? Do you know where your parents met? Do you know an illness or something really terrible that happened in your family? Do you know the story of your birth? Okay, so basic questions, right? Not just password questions, right? These are they're just basic questions of the family. Dr. Duke and Dr. Fivish asked those questions to 4 dozen families in the summer of 2001 and taped several of their dinner table conversations. That would be illegal to tap them. They then compared the children's, this is before the Patriot laws, right? They then compared the children's results to a battery of psychological tests the children had taken and reached the overwhelming conclusion. The more the children knew about their family's history, the stronger their sense of control over their lives, and the higher their self-esteem, and the more successfully they believed in their family. They believed their families functioned. The Do You Know scale turned to be the best single predictor of a child's emotional health and happiness. Isn't that wild? Right? We were blown away. Now it gets better. Because when was this research conducted? June 2001. And then something unexpected happened. 2 months later was September 11th, 2001. As citizens, Dr. Duke and Dr. Fivish were horrified by everything else, but like everyone else. But as psychologists, they knew they had been given a rare opportunity. Though the families they studied had not been directly affected by these events, all children had experienced the same national trauma at the same time. The researchers went back and reassessed the children. Once again, Dr. Duke said, the ones who knew more about their families proved to be more resilient, meaning they could moderate the effects of stress. What does knowing about where your grandmother went to school help a child overcome something as minor as a skinned knee or as major as a terrorist attack? The answer has to do with a child's sense of being part of a larger family, Dr. Duke said. Remarkable. Right, and now think about this for a second. He's only talking about small families. Right? He's just talking about this concentric ring. And he goes into further research and he talks about how to create traditions of families and how to create, gatherings of the meals where we talk about our families. But think about this, folks. We've been given on a golden platter. Think about this. Every Shabbos we get together, and every Pesach we get together. We talk about parents and grandparents. We get to be forced to come together and to talk about not just our family traditions, our greater family, and why we got to where we are. Could there be no greater sense of family values, of what it means to be part of a larger family, to be carrying a story? It's remarkable. We don't need to recreate this. When we lived in Chicago, we were looking for a dining room table, so we went on Craigslist We found this table. We rented a U-Haul, went out into the suburbs and got this beautiful table. It was 11 years old, and when they took off the cloth, you could see your reflection in the wood because it was so pristine. And it's 11 years old. And so we said, like, how often did you use this? She says, Thanksgiving and Xmas. You know, that was the time when people would use their dining room table. There's the time to be around the kitchen or on the couch with the TV. And I said, don't worry, we'll take care of it in just a few years. Because Jews, we use dining room tables. That's what happens, right? We have the family. We're forced to have the family every week. And yes, maybe there's not a formula to talk about the values, but we can. We should. We ought to. And on Pesach, we're forced to. In fact, it is mandated that we have to talk about the notion of our family. And how many of the Siddurim we think about in our lives, where we go back to hear our parents, our family's stories, and how it connects the dots to the journey that we're taking now. It's remarkable to me when I hear people who talk about this and they talk about how they're not going to give their children, they're not going to force it down their children's throat. They're going to allow their children to discover it by themselves and make their own decisions. What hogwash. I mean, it's unbelievable. I'm basically not going to tell you the story of how we got here. You're not part of anything meaningful. I'm going to let you go like driftwood down the river, and I'm going to hope that somebody else's narrative does not prey upon you, and you go and now find the truth. What nonsense. How can you possibly expect a child to know who they are without telling him what they're part of? I'm going to hope they're going to discover it. That is not the way it works. Somebody else will discover your child and give them a narrative. That's what's going to happen, right? We need to understand the importance of telling our children who they are, where they're coming from, and where they're going because of that. That's not brainwashing. That's education. Education is allowing them to understand they're part of something bigger. And yes, they can make decisions of how they fall into that pattern, but allow them that. Give them that. Okay?
I heard Rabbi Pelkowitz Alav Shalom once in one of his speeches, and he was talking when I was pretty young, but it stuck with me, that there was a disease coming to the Jewish community, and he coined this phrase, affluenza. But what he said was, we're so busy trying to give our children what we didn't have, that we're not giving them what we did have.
Exactly, precisely that. And in that void, into that void, we create children who are confused. We create children who don't know what story they're carrying, don't know where they're going or what they're doing with it, because instead of giving them, as you said, so to speak, what is the most insightful and necessary tool for their survival, which is their story, we give them everything that they ask for, which is not necessarily what they need. So this is the danger of that we're facing right now. And by the way, most of American Jewry is not succeeding. And the longer we wait every generation, the more we're losing the story again. We need to tell the story. We need to be able to tell where we came from, why we're carrying the story, no matter what language, no matter which country we lived in, the story needs to continue. And by the way, you know who understood this so well? Dr. Martin Luther King. He was so brilliant. Listen to this speech, 1963, in Memphis, Tennessee, in the Mason Temple. He says, and this is a speech called I've Been to the Mountaintop, one of the most brilliant orators of the 20th century. Dr. King said the following: something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world. And as you know, if I was standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of taking a kind of general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? I would take my mental flight by Egypt, and I would watch God's children in their magnificent trek from the dark dungeons of Egypt, through, or rather across the Red Sea, through the wilderness or towards the Promised Land, and in spite of its magnificence, I wouldn't stop there. I would move on to Greece and take my mind to the Mount Olympus, and I would see Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides, Aristophanes assembled at the Pantheon, and I would watch them around the Pantheon and as they discussed the great and eternal issues of reality, and I wouldn't stop there. I would go on, even to the great heyday of the Roman Empire, and I would see the developments around there through various emperors and leaders, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even come up to the day of the Renaissance and get a quick picture of all that Renaissance did for the cultural and aesthetic life of man, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even go back. I would even go by the way of that man for whom I am named, had his habitat. And I would watch Martin Luther the German, as he tacked the 95 Theses on the door of the Church of Wittenberg, but I wouldn't stop there, the Reformation. I would come back even to 1863 and watch the vacillating president by the name of Abraham Lincoln finally come to the conclusion that he had to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, but I wouldn't stop there. I would come back to the early 30s and see a man grappling with the problems of the bankruptcy of his nation and come up with an eloquent cry that we have nothing to fear but fear itself, but I wouldn't stop there. Strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. Now that's a strange statement to make, because the world is all messed up, the nation is sick, trouble is in the land. By the way, It's not just now. Right? You see, then in the 60s, right, folks were concerned. The confusion is all around. That's a strange statement, but I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And I see God working on this period of the 20th century in a way that men, in some strange way, are responding. Something is happening in our world. The masses of the people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they're in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same. We want to be free. What a remarkable perspective. Like, think about this speech. Imagine being there. But what is he doing? What is he essentially doing? He's connecting the story of civil rights to the stories of old. That's what he's doing. He's saying this is part of the same story. And multiple times will he actually use the Exodus as the model of what it means to fight for civil rights. The Hebrew people fighting for emancipation as the black people in America fighting for the civil rights they deserve in this country, a country of freedom. And think about that. What he's doing is he's giving them a story. He's giving people a story. That's what we need to do. That's what connects people. That's what gives people a mission in life as well. He understood this only too well. And I think perhaps this is what explains one part of the Haggadah which we always take for granted. The Haggadah tells us that there's 4 children who ask us about the story. And one of them is called the Ben HaRasha. Why is that? The Haggadah says, Rasha ma omer, ma avoda zas lachem. What is this business to you? The end of this is in Parshas Bo, Perek Yud Beis, where he asks this question. V'loi, he excludes himself. He has denied all reality. He has denied everything. Think about this for a second. There's a notion in halacha what's called a mumar. A mumar is a person who ejects themselves from halachic Judaism. And that can be a very serious thing. But there's what's called mumar le-mitzvah achas, and mumar le-Torah kulai. A person who rejects, we'll call it one aspect of Torah, not as serious, it's serious, but not as serious as a person who rejects the whole Torah, right? So what is considered a person who rejects the whole Torah? So that could be a person who denies all the mitzvahs, or perhaps denies the belief in God by serving Avodah Zarah, or Shabbos. Those are the 2 we'll call most central of the mitzvahs, which will therefore forfeit that person being part of Klal Yisrael. But let's say a person, is a mumar for a particular mitzvah. That doesn't necessarily affect their standing in Klal Yisrael for this particular mitzvah. Now, it's something to be corrected, but it doesn't necessarily warrant that. Now, what's he rejecting? He's saying, Ma avodah hazas lachem. What is this business of the Korban Pesach? So you should say, okay, Korban Pesach is a very important part of Judaism, but that doesn't mean to say, kafar ba'ikar. Right? That's not one of the 13 ikare emunah. It's not one of the foundations of our faith. Why should that be so serious? And so that's precisely the point. We don't think about this. The Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva, there are a number of people who forfeit their place in the world to come. The Rambam says in Source 7, HaPoresh midarkei tzibur, a person who separates themselves from the ways of the community. Aval bishaloi avar averos, even though that person is not necessarily transgressing overt sins. El nivdal me'adas Yisrael, he's left we'll call the community. He doesn't necessarily do mitzvahs with everybody else, doesn't feel their pain, doesn't fast their fasts. It just goes along like any other nation, any other person. The Rambam says that person loses out because what have you done? You've stopped telling the story. You've stopped being part of the story. That's what the problem with the Rasha is. It's not about the Korban Pesach. It's not about a particular mitzvah. It's the fact that he says, I don't believe that I was there. I don't believe that I needed to be there. I don't believe this whole thing affects me. It may have been there. My answer is, that's a nice theory. That's a good myth. It's good for the children. But in the end of the day, what's that have to do with me? That's what the Rasha is saying. That person's kafar ba'ikar. What's ikar? Ikar is our identity. Our place in this whole world is dependent on this story. This is who we are. It's not just like an idea, myth, as many archaeologists would say. That's what is happening with the Rasha. And it goes one step further. And this is something actually we learned yesterday, but I want to reiterate it because it's such a powerful, powerful observation. The Gemara says, and I apologize, Paul and my mother were actually here yesterday as we learned this, but I want to just reiterate this at the same time because it's so incredibly powerful. So here's the observation. The Gemara tells us in Brachos and Daf Yudalad or Aleph that there's a halacha that a person is not allowed to greet another person before davening. Right? Now, that doesn't mean to say you're not supposed to be polite, but before you daven in the morning, you shouldn't go out of your way to somebody else. Like, so to speak, actively go to them and say, go to their place, go to their house and say and greet them. You pass them in the street, that's fine. You can say, good morning, Safra Demari Tav, that's fine. But you shouldn't go out of your way to greet another person. So the Gemara has a very interesting metaphor for this, and the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yonah, Amar Rabbi Zera, Kol ha'oyse chafotzav kodem sheyispalal kilu ban Obama. Person who, this is actually the next statement. A person does his business. But the previous line of the Gemara was, we get no sense shalom, a person who gives who gives greetings or peace to another person before he davens, it's as if they built a bama. What's an bama? A bama is a little mizbeach, a little altar in their backyard to God. It's not serving avodah zarah, but it's creating your own way of service. So Rav Kook says, well, that's a strange image, kilu bama. Why would that be the case? So Rav Kook says the following. He says there's two reasons why we can create a harmonious society, a society that has peace within it. The first and most basic utilitarian way observation is that the reason why we cooperate with each other is because if I were out for myself, I wouldn't succeed. Right? Because what's that going to happen? If I'm just for myself, there's going to be a bigger and stronger, individual who's going to come over and take over my possessions and, dispossess me and take over my land. So it's too risky for me to just be for myself. So what we'll do is we'll band together, and whether it be all the farms in this little locale, or all the hunter-gatherers in this particular group, or whatever it is that we choose to do, we'll call this village, and we'll say we'll all work together so we can outsource security to another force, we'll call them police, and we can outsource, unexpected events to another force, we'll call them the fire department. We can outsource taking out the garbage to another department. We can pay this, and together we're stronger, right? But ultimately, why are we creating the society? Why are we creating a safe and secure society? Because of our own needs, right? I mean, to say, I am better with you. Not because I don't particularly like you, but, we do better together, right? That's how society is created. There's another way that you can create harmonious society, and that's because you say like this, well, I believe in God. I believe in God Almighty. And God has endowed all of us with a little piece of Him, which means to say the reason why we should get together is because, and we should work harmoniously, is because actually, He wants us to work together like He has created other ecosystems, right? So He has created macro ecosystems, right? So we'll call it on a universal level, galaxies, solar systems. It's all an unbelievable harmony. And then on the micro level, if you look at the cellular biology, the ecosystem is remarkable. There's one place where harmony doesn't seem to reside so much, and that's in the human domain, right? And that's where the ecosystem doesn't work so well. Human beings like to put their foot in it, whether it be a relationship or the ecology or whatever else it is, and then try to regulate backwards after they've made the mess. So Hashem says, I want you to work out harmony a priori. I want you to working together because it makes me happy when you guys work together. And therefore, the reason I can create a society, or should create a society, is not because I need you, but rather because God needs us. That's a different way of looking at it. So says Rav Kook the following. Those two different societies will have different endings. So take a look at source 9. It's in the right-hand column here. He says in the middle of the first line, Omnam, when we take a look at this, he says in his commentary in the Gemara and Brachos, we'll see there's a difference between a society governed by a lofty value, a higher calling, which can only be achieved through this higher calling when there's harmony between the creations, or a society created by essentially the best for all individuals, the greater good. The first one is actually about really loving the larger community for itself, for its own integral value. Al-Kain, Kirbos Yamim, Tosib Avasa Klalis Kadel, Viknesia Shihil Hashem Shemaim, Shesofolis Kayem. If my value in loving the rest of everybody else is because God wants it, then the bigger the community, the more I'm going to love them, because ultimately God wants more harmony, even the bigger as it gets. Aval ha'achdus lematara shel avas kol yachid atzmai hi achdus mikrit. When I love everybody else, I cooperate with everybody else because I need them, then it's essentially it is not inherent. It is circumstantial that we're working together. It's circumstantial that we all need the same police force right now. Which really means to say that I'm doing this because I love myself, and it's better for me to work with you. That will never last. It doesn't actually have a single convergence point. It doesn't have a single, we'll call underpinning or anchor, which holds the whole society together. There's going to be somebody who's going to say, to heck with all of this, I need this, right? And they're going to utilize this community, this gathering for their own purposes, and whether it be funds or security or whatever else it is that they're going to embezzle or they're going to misappropriate, is because ultimately it all stems from self-interest, not communal interest, or not a higher calling. But and it'll turn into the fire of hate and the war of brothers. And now he goes on to say, when we live on our land, in the land of Israel, and we will build the Beis Hamikdash, when we have one calling point, and that's the Beis Hamikdash, that is our story. That's our central point which focuses all of our lives. That's why we can't have individual ways we serve God, even if it's on our block or our community and it's more convenient and we don't have to go to the Beis Hamikdash all the time. It's a little easier, right? That's not the way it should be. Even though it serves us all in this particular area, it's hard to get to the Beis Hamikdash, right? So even though it's going to serve us, that, in a certain sense, it actually dilutes the larger message, the larger underpinning of that society. And it will undermine the unity of the nation. Because it is the calling of our service of God. It is the higher calling of our society. What does it mean, a person who gives peace to their friend before they daven? It's not just, hi, how are you? Nice to see you. That's not what it means. A person who says that I'm going to create a society where I'll say shalom lachavero, meaning to say I'm going to create peace before I daven. I'm going to create a society where we can say shalom to each other without the davening yet, without God in the picture, without a higher calling, without a message, without a story. That's not going to last. It's like I'm building a bomb. It's like I'm saying I'm going to take this large value and I'm going to make my own little group over here, right? Because I'm not part of the larger value, the underpinning, the anchor of that society. Isn't that a brilliant metaphor, right? If I start taking pieces away from the story, if I start taking pieces away from the larger ideal of society, that society ain't going to last. That's what Rav Kook is saying over here. Is in order for society to work, you need to have a higher calling, because otherwise it's just based on our own needs. And when it comes down to our own needs, somebody's going to have larger needs than ours, and they're going to use and utilize our collective for some other nefarious purpose as well. So let's go back for a second and just to appreciate this. What David Ben-Gurion was saying in 1936, and he was absolutely correct. Unfortunately, perhaps I would wonder if his grandchildren know the story that he was telling. That's the danger of today, is that in every single Jewish child who's grown up with a smattering of a Jewish education knows the story of Egypt. But it's important that we continue to tell that story, because our future, our understanding of Lashon Haba Yerushalayim depends on our knowing the past as well. One of the most incredible ingredients in nationhood, which is why throughout Parashas Bo, which we're arriving at right now, is about knowing our story. Let's make sure that our children continue to know that story in order to be part of that nation.